Woman left construction worker, husband to move up in life. He built real estate empire and she returned, humiliated. The sound of Sandra's high heels clicking across the concrete floor echoed through their small ranch-style home in Phoenix as she dragged suitcases from room to room. Anthony Martinez watched from the living room doorway, his work boots still caked with dried cement from another 12-hour shift, laying foundations in the Arizona heat. His calloused hands gripped the doorframe as he tried to process what was happening. "Sandra, please," he said, his voice hoarse from breathing construction dust all day. "The kids will hear you. Can't we talk about this?" But his wife of 16 years barely glanced at him as she stuffed designer clothes into expensive luggage. Clothes she'd bought with credit cards he didn't even know existed. 14-year-old Lucas appeared in the hallway, still in his basketball uniform from practice, with 11-year-old Beatrice close behind. Both children's faces showed the confusion and fear that comes from watching their world collapse without understanding why. Sandra looked at them with the cold detachment of someone who had already made her decision. "Kids, Mommy has to go away for a while," she said, not bothering to kneel down to their level or offer any real explanation. "Your father will take care of you." Her voice carried no emotion, no regret, as if she were discussing the weather rather than abandoning her family. Anthony stepped forward, his voice desperate. "Sandra, whatever's wrong, we can fix it. I know money's been tight, but I'm picking up extra shifts and maybe I can—" She cut him off with a laugh that sounded more like a bark. "Fix it?" She spun around to face him, and for the first time that day, real emotion flashed in her eyes. Disgust. "Anthony, look at yourself. You're 45 years old, and you still come home covered in cement dust every day. Your hands are permanently stained, your back is already going, and for what? $3,000 a month? I'm tired of living like this." She gestured around their modest home, with its second-hand furniture and worn carpet. "I'm tired of my friends asking what my husband does, and having to admit he's a construction worker. I'm tired of clipping coupons and shopping at discount stores and pretending this is enough." Her voice rose with each word, and the children instinctively moved closer to their father. "I met someone," she continued, pulling out her phone to show him photos of expensive restaurants and luxury cars. "David Thompson is a bank manager. He wears suits to work, drives a BMW and lives in Scottsdale. He can give me the life I deserve, the life I should have had all along." Anthony felt the words hit him like physical blows. 20 years of marriage, 20 years of working in 100-degree heat to provide for his family, 20 years of putting everyone else's needs before his own, and this was how she saw him. As an embarrassment to be discarded for someone with a better job title. "What about Lucas and Beatrice?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "They need their mother." But Sandra was already heading for the door, her suitcases rolling behind her on the tile floor. "They'll be fine with you," she said without looking back. "Maybe this will finally motivate you to make something of yourself instead of just laying bricks for other people." She paused at the door and turned back one final time. "I want a man who wears a suit to work, not a hard hat. I want someone who builds businesses, not just foundations." The door slammed shut with such force that the family photos on the nearby table rattled. Through the window, Anthony watched Sandra load her suitcases into a silver BMW, presumably David's car. She didn't look back at the house, didn't wave goodbye to the children who were now crying openly, didn't show any sign that leaving her family caused her even a moment's hesitation. Lucas and Beatrice ran to their father, wrapping their arms around his cement-stained work clothes as tears streamed down their faces. "Daddy, why did Mommy leave?" Beatrice asked in a small voice that broke Anthony's heart into 1,000 pieces. Anthony knelt down and pulled both children close, his own eyes burning with unshed tears. "I don't know, sweetheart," he said honestly, "but I promise you this, I will never leave you. No matter what happens, we're going to stick together and take care of each other." As the BMW disappeared down their street, Anthony felt something inside him harden. Sandra wanted a man who built businesses instead of just foundations. Maybe it was time to show her, and himself, exactly what kind of man he really was. The credit card statements arrived 3 days after Sandra left, and Anthony felt his knees buckle as he read the numbers. $47,000 in debt spread across 6 different cards he'd never seen before. Sandra had been living a secret life of expensive dinners, designer clothes, and luxury spa treatments while he worked overtime to keep their modest household afloat. The children were struggling to adjust to their mother's absence. Beatrice had started wetting the bed again, something she hadn't done since she was 5, and Lucas had been getting into fights at school. The counselor called Anthony at work, explaining that his son was acting out because he blamed himself for their mother leaving. "Mr. Martinez," she said gently, "children often think that if they had been better behaved or gotten better grades, their parent wouldn't have left. Lucas needs to understand that this isn't his fault." But how could Anthony explain something he didn't fully understand himself? The financial pressure was crushing. With Sandra gone, Anthony had lost her part-time income from working at a boutique, but the expenses remained the same. The mortgage, utilities, groceries, and now the credit card minimum payments consumed every penny he earned. He started working 7 days a week, taking any construction job he could find, but it still wasn't enough. Some nights, Anthony would sit at the kitchen table after the children were asleep, staring at the bills and wondering how he was going to make it work. His back ached constantly from years of heavy lifting, his hands were permanently stained from concrete and mortar, and now he was facing bankruptcy because of debts he'd never agreed to take on. The neighbors whispered when they thought he couldn't hear them. "Poor Anthony," they'd say. "His wife left him for a bank manager. Can't say I blame her. Construction work is so unstable, and she was always dressed so nicely. She probably got tired of the uncertainty." The comments cut deep because part of him wondered if they were right. Maybe Sandra had been justified in leaving. Maybe he really was a failure as a husband and provider. Maybe a real man would have found a way to give his wife the life she wanted instead of coming home dirty and exhausted every day. The self-doubt ate at him like acid, making him question everything he thought he knew about himself. But then he would look at Lucas and Beatrice, and something fierce would rise up in his chest. These children needed him to be strong, needed him to prove that hard work and dedication meant something, needed him to show them that their father was worth more than Sandra's cruel dismissal suggested. One Saturday morning, while the kids were still sleeping, Anthony drove through some of the newer developments in Phoenix, looking at the houses being built by major construction companies. He'd worked on similar projects as a subcontractor, laying foundations and building walls that other men designed and profited from. For the first time, he began to wonder why he'd never considered designing and building something of his own. The idea was terrifying and exciting at the same time. Anthony had 20 years of construction experience. He understood every aspect of building a house from foundation to roof, and he'd saved $15,000 over the years by living modestly and avoiding debt. What if Sandra was right about one thing? What if he could build something bigger than just other people's foundations? That afternoon, he took Lucas and Beatrice to a vacant lot in an up-and-coming neighborhood where young families were starting to move. The land was affordable because it was still considered rough around the edges, but Anthony could see its potential. Good schools nearby, easy access to major highways, and plenty of room for families to grow. "What are we looking at, Dad?" Lucas asked, kicking at the desert dirt with his sneakers. Anthony put his hand on his son's shoulder and pointed across the empty lot. "The future," he said simply. "We're looking at our future." The $15,000 Anthony had saved represented 5 years of sacrifice. Skipped lunches, driving his old pickup truck instead of buying something newer, wearing clothes until they literally fell apart. It was supposed to be the family's emergency fund, but Sandra's abandonment had created the biggest emergency of his life. Anthony spent weeks researching the real estate market, visiting the county planning office, and studying zoning regulations. He learned about permit requirements, utility connections, and building codes with the same methodical attention to detail he'd always applied to his construction work. The lot he'd chosen was priced at $12,000, almost all of his savings, but the owner was motivated to sell. The risk was enormous. If his plan failed, he and the children would have nothing left. But Anthony had reached a point where doing nothing felt more dangerous than taking the leap. Sandra's debts were growing with interest charges, and his construction wages would never be enough to dig them out of the hole she'd created. He made the decision on a Tuesday morning after dropping the kids at school. Walking into the real estate office in his cleanest work clothes, Anthony felt every eye in the room judging his appearance. The other clients were dressed in business suits and designer clothes, discussing million-dollar properties and investment portfolios. He was a construction worker with cement under his fingernails, trying to buy his first piece of land. But when Anthony spoke with the agent about his plans, something shifted in the room's atmosphere. He didn't just want to buy the lot. He had detailed blueprints for a modest 3-bedroom house that would appeal to first-time home buyers. He understood soil conditions, drainage requirements, and construction timelines in ways that impressed even the experienced real estate professionals. "Mr. Martinez," the agent said, after reviewing his proposal, "you've clearly done your homework. This is one of the most thorough development plans I've seen from an individual buyer. How long have you been in construction?" When Anthony explained his 20 years of experience, the agent smiled. "Then you know exactly what you're getting into." The paperwork took 3 hours to complete, and when Anthony signed the final document, his hands were shaking. $12,000, almost everything he had in the world, was now tied up in a vacant lot in Phoenix. But for the first time since Sandra left, Anthony felt a surge of hope mixed with his fear. That evening, he sat down with Lucas and Beatrice to explain what he was planning. "Dad's going to build us a house," he said simply. "Not just any house. A house we can sell to make money so we can build more houses. It's going to be hard work, and I'll need your help with some things. But if it works, we might be able to have a better life." Lucas, now mature beyond his 14 years, asked the question Anthony had been dreading. "What if it doesn't work, Dad? What if we lose our house?" Anthony was quiet for a long moment before answering. "Then we'll figure something else out. But I'd rather try and fail than spend the rest of my life wondering what might have been." The next morning, Anthony woke up before dawn and drove to his new lot. Standing in the desert silence, watching the sun rise over the empty land, he felt a mixture of terror and determination that he'd never experienced before. Sandra had left him because she thought he was small, thought he lacked ambition, thought he would never be more than a man who built other people's dreams. Today, he would start building his own. The first house took 6 months to complete, and Anthony worked on it every weekend and holiday while maintaining his regular construction job during the week. Lucas and Beatrice became his unofficial assistants, bringing him water during the hottest parts of the day and helping with simple tasks like sorting nails and cleaning up debris. The physical demands were brutal. Anthony would finish a 10-hour shift, laying foundations for other contractors, then drive to his lot and work until darkness made it impossible to continue. His body ached constantly, and some mornings he could barely get out of bed. But he pushed forward because failure wasn't an option. The children learned to fend for themselves in ways that broke Anthony's heart, but also made him proud. Beatrice taught herself to do laundry and make simple meals, while Lucas took on more responsibilities around their own house. They never complained about their father's long hours or the financial sacrifices they were all making. Anthony's co-workers thought he was crazy. "You're killing yourself for what?" one of them said during a lunch break. "Even if you sell that house, you'll barely break even after materials and permits. You're better off just working steady and collecting your paycheck." But Anthony had done the math, and he knew something they didn't understand. The house he was building would sell for $68,000 in the current market, a fair price for first-time home buyers in that neighborhood. His materials and permit costs totaled $22,000, and since he was providing all the labor himself, his profit would be close to $35,000, more than a year's salary from his regular job, earned in 6 months of weekend work. But the real education came from watching the real estate market and understanding what buyers actually wanted. Anthony spent his lunch breaks visiting model homes in new developments, talking to sales agents about what features sold houses quickly and which ones sat on the market for months. He learned that young families cared more about storage space and functional layouts than fancy finishes. They wanted 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, and an open kitchen where parents could cook while watching their children play. They needed decent-sized closets, a laundry room, and a small backyard where kids could run around safely. Anthony's design was simple but smart. He included everything buyers needed while avoiding expensive extras that didn't add real value. The result was a house that looked significantly more expensive than it actually was to build, with clean lines and practical features that would appeal to his target market. The first potential buyers arrived before Anthony had even finished installing the kitchen cabinets. A young couple with a toddler fell in love with the house immediately, praising the thoughtful layout and quality construction. They offered the full asking price and wanted to close within 30 days. Standing in the driveway as the buyers walked through his completed house, Anthony felt a pride unlike anything he'd experienced in his 20 years of construction work. This wasn't just a job. It was his vision, his effort, his risk that had created something valuable from nothing but empty desert land. The closing took place on a Friday afternoon, and when Anthony walked out of the title company with a check for $46,000 after all expenses, he had to sit in his truck for several minutes to compose himself. He'd done it. He'd actually done it. That night, he took Lucas and Beatrice to their favorite restaurant, the first time they'd eaten out since Sandra left. "Dad," Beatrice said over her chocolate cake, "are we rich now?" Anthony smiled and shook his head. "No, sweetheart, but we're not poor anymore either. And this is just the beginning." The next morning, Anthony was back at the county office, looking at building permits for his second house. This time, he had enough profit from the first house to buy 2 lots and build simultaneously. The man Sandra had dismissed as just a construction worker was about to become a real estate developer. 2 years after Sandra's departure, Anthony owned 6 rental properties and had 3 more houses under construction. What started as a desperate attempt to survive financially had evolved into a thriving real estate business that generated more income in a month than his old construction job paid in a year. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. Each house taught Anthony something new about the market, about construction efficiency, and about what buyers really wanted. He'd made mistakes. A roof that leaked during the first monsoon season. A floor plan that looked good on paper but felt cramped in reality. But he learned from every error and improved with each project. Lucas had grown into Anthony's most trusted assistant, spending summers working on construction sites and learning the business from the ground up. At 16, he could read blueprints, operate basic power tools safely, and had already expressed interest in studying business and real estate in college. Beatrice, now 13, showed a natural talent for design and often suggested improvements to Anthony's house plans that made them more appealing to families. The financial pressure that had once threatened to destroy them was now a distant memory. Anthony had paid off Sandra's credit card debts within 18 months, bought a reliable crew cab pickup truck, and moved the family to a beautiful 4-bedroom house in one of Phoenix's better neighborhoods. The children attended good schools, participated in extracurricular activities, and never had to worry about whether there would be money for necessities. But success brought new challenges. As Anthony's business grew, he needed help managing the increased workload. He'd hired 4 full-time construction workers and was considering bringing on a project manager to handle scheduling and client communication. The man who had once worked alone was now responsible for other people's livelihoods. Anthony's reputation in the Phoenix real estate community had grown as well. Real estate agents knew that his houses were well built and priced fairly, which meant they sold quickly and without problems. Young families specifically sought out Martinez Construction Homes because they trusted the quality and knew they were getting good value for their money. The business had also evolved beyond just building and selling individual houses. Anthony had identified an underserved market segment. Working families who made too much money to qualify for low-income housing programs but couldn't afford the expensive homes being built by major developers. His houses filled that gap perfectly, offering quality construction at prices that teachers, firefighters, and other middle-class families could actually afford. One afternoon, while reviewing plans for his next development project, Anthony received a text from a number he didn't recognize. "I heard you're doing well for yourself these days. It read, "Maybe we should talk. Sandra." The message hit him like a punch to the gut, bringing back memories he'd worked hard to put behind him. Lucas, who was helping with paperwork, noticed his father's expression. "Dad, what's wrong?" he asked with concern. Anthony showed him the message, and his son's face hardened with an anger that reminded Anthony of himself 2 years earlier. "She has some nerve," Lucas said, his voice tight with controlled fury. "After what she put us through, after calling you a failure and walking out on us, now she wants to talk because you're successful." The teenager's protective instincts toward his father were touching and heartbreaking at the same time. Anthony deleted the message without responding and turned his attention back to the blueprints spread across his desk. He had 4 houses to complete before the end of the year, a meeting with the bank about financing his next land purchase, and college planning sessions with both children. Sandra's sudden reappearance was just another distraction from the life he'd built without her. But that evening, as he walked through the construction site of his latest project, Anthony found himself thinking about the man he'd been when Sandra left versus the man he'd become. The physical transformation was obvious. His hands were still calloused, but now they signed contracts instead of just mixing concrete. His work clothes were still dusty, but now he wore them by choice rather than necessity. More importantly, the self-doubt that had plagued him during those first terrible months was gone. Anthony knew exactly what he was worth, both financially and as a person. Sandra's opinion no longer had the power to make him question his value or his choices. Whatever she wanted to talk about would have to wait until he decided he was ready to listen. The confrontation came at the worst possible moment. Anthony was meeting with potential investors at his newest construction site when Sandra appeared, stepping out of an expensive car driven by a man in a business suit. She looked exactly as Anthony remembered, perfectly dressed, professionally styled, radiating the confidence of someone who expected to get what she wanted. "Anthony," she called out, her voice carrying across the construction site with practiced authority. "I've been trying to reach you. We need to talk." The investors, sensing personal drama, excused themselves and promised to call later about financing Anthony's next development project. Anthony watched Sandra approach, noting how her designer heels struggled for stability on the uneven ground of the construction site. The man who had driven her stayed in the car, apparently unwilling to get involved in whatever conversation was about to take place. Sandra's perfect composure faltered slightly as she took in the scope of Anthony's current project, a planned community of 24 houses in various stages of completion. "This is impressive," she said, gesturing around the bustling construction site where Anthony's crew was working on multiple houses simultaneously. "I heard you were doing well, but I didn't realize you'd become such a successful businessman." The pause before successful businessman was telling. She was still struggling to reconcile her memory of Anthony with the reality of what he'd become. Anthony didn't respond immediately, instead picking up a set of blueprints and rolling them carefully before turning his full attention to the woman who had abandoned him and their children 3 years earlier. His silence made Sandra uncomfortable, and she filled the quiet space with nervous chatter about how good he looked and how proud she was that he'd figured things out. "What do you want, Sandra?" Anthony finally asked, his voice calm but not welcoming. He noticed that she flinched slightly at his directness. Apparently she had expected a warmer reception from the man she'd once dismissed as a failure. Sandra's carefully prepared speech began with apologies and regrets, but quickly moved to her real purpose. David Thompson, the bank manager she'd left Anthony for, had turned out to be married with no intention of leaving his wife. Worse, he'd been embezzling money from the bank to fund his lifestyle, and when the FBI investigation began, Sandra found herself unemployed and under scrutiny as a potential accomplice. "I know I made mistakes," she said, her voice becoming more desperate as Anthony's expression remained unchanged. "But I was confused, and David made me think that we could have a better life together. I realize now that I already had everything I needed with you and the children." Anthony listened without interruption, watching Sandra's practiced performance with the detached interest of someone who had long since moved beyond caring about her justifications. When she finished her explanation, he was quiet for a long moment before responding. "Sandra, "I'm sorry you're going through difficulties," he said finally. "I wouldn't wish legal troubles or unemployment on anyone, but I'm not sure why you're telling me this or what you expect me to do about it." His tone was polite but distant, like he might speak to any acquaintance who had fallen on hard times. The response clearly wasn't what Sandra had expected. She moved closer, reaching out to touch Anthony's arm in a gesture that had once been familiar, but now felt inappropriate. "Anthony, I want to come home. I want us to be a family again. Look at what you've accomplished. You've become exactly the kind of man I always knew you could be." Anthony stepped back from her touch, his expression hardening slightly. "Sandra, the man standing here is the same man you left 3 years ago. The only thing that changed was that I stopped letting you convince me I wasn't enough." He gestured toward the construction site around them. "All of this came from the same work ethic, the same skills, and the same determination that you found so embarrassing when I was laying other people's foundations." Before Sandra could respond, Lucas appeared from behind one of the partially completed houses, now 17 and nearly as tall as his father. His expression when he saw his mother was a mixture of hurt and anger that made Sandra take an involuntary step backward. "What's she doing here?" Lucas asked, his voice carrying an edge that Anthony had never heard before. "And why is she talking about coming home like she has any right to be part of our family?" The teenager's protective instincts toward his father and sister were obvious, and Sandra realized that her children's loyalty now belonged entirely to Anthony. The meeting that would define Anthony's response to Sandra's return took place the following evening at his home, a beautiful 4-bedroom house in one of Phoenix's most desirable family neighborhoods. Sandra had insisted on meeting with both children present, claiming she needed to rebuild relationships with Lucas and Beatrice. But Anthony had spent 3 years learning to protect his family from exactly this kind of emotional manipulation. He'd arranged for Lucas and Beatrice to stay with his sister for the evening, ensuring that Sandra couldn't use their presence to pressure him into decisions that weren't in anyone's best interest. Sandra arrived in the same expensive car, though this time she was driving herself. Anthony noticed that her designer clothes, while still elegant, showed signs of wear that suggested her financial situation was more precarious than she'd initially admitted. She spent several minutes admiring the house, commenting on the quality of construction and the expensive furnishings with an appreciation that felt calculated. "You've done well for yourself," she said, settling into the leather sofa in Anthony's spacious living room. "This place must be worth what? 400,000? 500? It's exactly the kind of home I always dreamed we'd have someday." Anthony poured himself a glass of water but didn't offer Sandra anything. He'd learned in business that small gestures of hospitality could be misinterpreted as signs of willingness to negotiate, and he wanted to keep this conversation strictly factual. "Sandra, let's skip the small talk," he said, taking a seat across from her rather than beside her on the sofa. "You said you needed to discuss something important. What exactly do you want?" His directness clearly made her uncomfortable, but Anthony had learned that allowing Sandra to control conversations led to emotional manipulation and false promises. What followed was a revelation that explained Sandra's sudden reappearance and desperate attempts at reconciliation. David Thompson hadn't just been embezzling from the bank. He'd been running an elaborate Ponzi scheme that had defrauded dozens of investors, including Sandra herself. She'd given him her savings, co-signed loans, and even used her employment history to help him secure additional victims. When the FBI investigation concluded, Sandra faced potential criminal charges as an accomplice. Her lawyer had managed to negotiate a plea agreement that avoided jail time, but she was now responsible for over $200,000 in restitution payments to Thompson's victims. Her wages would be garnished for the next 15 years, and her credit was completely destroyed. "Anthony, I need help," she said, abandoning her earlier pretense of wanting to rebuild their marriage for love. "I can't afford an apartment, I can't get a decent job with this criminal record, and I have nowhere else to turn. I know I hurt you, but we were married for 16 years. Doesn't that count for something?" The raw desperation in her voice was genuinely painful to witness. But Anthony had learned hard lessons about the difference between helping someone and enabling their poor choices. Sandra hadn't contacted him when she needed emotional support or wanted to rebuild relationships with their children. She'd only reached out when she needed financial rescue. "Sandra," Anthony said carefully, "I'm sorry you're in this situation, but I need you to understand something important. The life I've built with Lucas and Beatrice is stable, peaceful, and secure. I won't allow anything or anyone to threaten that stability, including you." He leaned forward slightly, his voice remaining calm but carrying unmistakable authority. "You made your choice 3 years ago when you decided that David's promises were more appealing than our family's reality. That choice had consequences for all of us, but we survived and rebuilt. Now your choice with David has consequences for you, and you need to face them without dragging us back into your chaos." Sandra's composure finally cracked, and tears began streaming down her face. "Please, Anthony, I have nowhere else to go. I'll do anything. I'll get a job. I'll help with the children. I'll sign whatever agreement you want. Just don't abandon me the way I abandoned you." The irony of her final statement wasn't lost on Anthony, but he felt no satisfaction in her desperation. This broken woman bore little resemblance to the confident, cruel person who had walked out of their lives, and her downfall brought him no joy. Anthony's decision came after a sleepless night spent weighing his responsibilities as a father, a former husband, and a man who had learned the hard way about the consequences of both cruelty and compassion. The next morning, he called Sandra and asked her to meet him at a coffee shop near downtown Phoenix, neutral territory where emotions could be kept in check. When Sandra arrived, the change in her appearance from just 24 hours earlier was striking. Gone were the designer clothes and perfect makeup, replaced by a simple dress and the hollow-eyed look of someone who had finally accepted the full scope of her situation. She looked like what she was, a woman who had gambled everything on the wrong person and lost. Anthony had brought a folder containing documents he'd prepared after their conversation. "Sandra, I've thought about what you said, and I've made a decision," he began, his voice businesslike but not unkind. "I'm going to help you, but not in the way you're expecting, and certainly not because I owe you anything." He slid a lease agreement across the table between them. "I own several rental properties around Phoenix. There's a 2-bedroom apartment in a safe neighborhood that I'll rent to you for $800 a month, about half the market rate. The lease is month to month, so if you can't make the payments or if you cause problems, you'll need to find somewhere else to live." Sandra looked at the document with surprise and hope, but Anthony wasn't finished. "I've also spoken to the general manager of a construction supply company where I do business. They need someone to handle inventory and customer service, and they're willing to hire you despite your legal issues. The pay is $32,000 a year, enough to cover rent, basic expenses, and your restitution payments if you're careful with money." The offer was more generous than Sandra had any right to expect, but Anthony's conditions were non-negotiable. "You'll have supervised visits with Lucas and Beatrice once a month at my house with me present. If you miss visits, show up under the influence of anything, or try to manipulate the children emotionally, the visits stop permanently. You will not discuss our past relationship with them, you will not make promises you can't keep, and you will not undermine the stability we've built." Sandra started to speak, but Anthony held up his hand. "I'm not finished. You need to understand that this arrangement is not about reconciliation. We will not be getting back together. We will not be rebuilding our marriage. And my help doesn't indicate forgiveness for what you did to our family. I'm doing this because Lucas and Beatrice deserve to have a relationship with their mother if she can prove she's capable of being a positive influence in their lives. The final condition was the most important. If you accept this offer, you'll sign a legal agreement stating that you make no claims on my business, my property, or my future earnings. What I've built belongs to me and our children, not to you. You'll also agree not to discuss our private family matters with anyone outside our immediate family." Sandra read through the documents with shaking hands, and Anthony could see her struggling between pride and desperation. The offer represented a lifeline. But it also forced her to acknowledge that she had no power in their relationship and no claim on the success she'd helped motivate through her cruelty. "Anthony," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper, "why are you doing this? After everything I did to you, after the things I said, why would you help me?" It was perhaps the first genuinely honest question she'd asked him in years. Anthony was quiet for a long moment, considering how to explain a decision that had been difficult even for him to understand. "Because," he said finally, "the man you married 20 years ago was always capable of this kind of generosity. You just spent so many years telling him he wasn't enough that he forgot who he was." He stood up from the table, preparing to leave. "The apartment is available immediately, and the job starts Monday if you want it. Take the weekend to decide, but understand that this offer won't be repeated if you turn it down. I've learned that some people need to hit bottom before they're ready to accept help, and I won't enable you to avoid the consequences of your choices." As Anthony walked toward the door, Sandra called out desperately, "What if I prove that I've changed? What if I become the person I should have been all along? Is there any chance?" But her voice trailed off as she saw Anthony's expression. "Sandra," he said gently but firmly, "I hope you do change. I hope you become someone our children can be proud of and someone who contributes positively to the world. But my feelings about our marriage died the day you walked out that door. What we had is over, and it's never coming back." 6 months after Sandra signed the lease agreement and started her new job, Anthony received the call he'd been dreading. His ex-wife had been arrested for violating her probation by missing required meetings with her parole officer and failing to make her court-ordered restitution payments. The job Anthony had helped her secure had lasted only 3 months before she was fired for chronic tardiness and attitude problems. The apartment he'd rented to her at below-market rates had become a source of constant complaints from neighbors about noise, unauthorized visitors, and suspected drug activity. When police searched the premises during Sandra's arrest, they found evidence that she'd been allowing her boyfriend, a man with an extensive criminal record, to live there in violation of her lease agreement. Anthony sat in his home office, surrounded by blueprints for his latest development project, feeling a mixture of disappointment and vindication. He'd given Sandra every opportunity to rebuild her life with dignity, and she'd chosen to squander those opportunities in favor of the same poor decision-making that had destroyed their marriage years earlier. Lucas, now 18 and preparing for college, had a different perspective on his mother's latest failure. "Dad, you did everything you could to help her," he said with the wisdom of someone who had been forced to grow up too quickly. "Some people just aren't capable of accepting help, even when they desperately need it." Beatrice, now 15 and showing early signs of her father's business acumen, was less forgiving. "She had a chance to be part of our lives again, and she threw it away," she said with anger that reminded Anthony of his own feelings years earlier. "I'm done pretending she's going to change. She is who she is." The irony wasn't lost on Anthony that Sandra's final failure had occurred at the exact moment when his own success was reaching new heights. Martinez Construction had just signed a contract to build an entire subdivision of affordable homes for first-time buyers, the largest project of Anthony's career. The company now employed 22 people full-time and had a reputation throughout Phoenix for quality construction and fair pricing. More importantly, Anthony had met someone who appreciated the man he'd always been, rather than trying to change him into someone else. Maria Gonzalez was an architect who specialized in affordable housing design, and their professional relationship had evolved into something deeper over the past year. She admired Anthony's work ethic, respected his devotion to his children, and understood the construction industry in ways that made her an invaluable partner both professionally and personally. "You know," Maria said one evening as they reviewed plans for the new subdivision, "Sandra probably thought she was trading up when she left you for that bank manager. She had no idea she was actually trading down from a man who would build an empire with his bare hands." Anthony smiled at the observation, but his response showed how much he'd grown beyond the need for vindication. "I don't think about Sandra much anymore," he said honestly. What she thought about me or my potential stopped mattering the day I realized my own worth. The conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. Anthony opened it to find a police officer holding an envelope. "Mr. Martinez, I have some documents regarding Sandra Martinez's case that require your signature as a witness." The paperwork concerned Sandra's latest arrest and the damage to the apartment Anthony had rented to her. As Anthony signed the necessary forms, he felt nothing. No satisfaction at Sandra's downfall, no anger at her latest betrayal, no regret about the help he'd offered. She had simply become irrelevant to the life he'd built. A cautionary tale rather than a source of ongoing pain. That night, as he tucked Beatrice into bed in their beautiful home, his daughter asked the question that had been on everyone's mind. "Dad, are you sad that Mom messed up again?" Anthony considered the question seriously before answering. "No, sweetheart," he said finally. "I'm sad for her because she's missing out on watching you and Lucas become incredible adults. But I'm not sad for us, because we have everything we need right here." It was perhaps the truest thing he'd ever said. 2 years later, Anthony stood on the balcony of his new office building, a 3-story structure that housed Martinez Construction's headquarters and several other businesses he'd acquired. At 50, he looked every inch the successful entrepreneur he'd become, though his hands still bore the calluses that reminded him of his origins in construction work. The company had grown beyond his wildest dreams from those desperate early days after Sandra's abandonment. Martinez Construction now employed over 60 people and had completed more than 200 homes across the Phoenix metropolitan area. Anthony's reputation for quality, integrity, and fair pricing had made him one of the most sought-after builders in Arizona's competitive construction market. But the numbers only told part of the story. Anthony had revolutionized affordable housing in Phoenix by proving that working families deserved quality construction and thoughtful design, not just the cheapest possible materials thrown together as quickly as possible. His developments featured amenities that other builders considered too expensive for budget homes. Mature landscaping, quality appliances, and architectural details that made residents proud to call their houses home. Lucas had graduated summa cum laude from Arizona State University with degrees in business and construction management, and was now Anthony's partner in running the company's day-to-day operations. At 21, he combined his father's work ethic with a natural understanding of modern marketing and technology that had helped Martinez Construction expand its reach throughout the Southwest. Beatrice, now 17, had already been accepted to several prestigious universities with full scholarships, planning to study architecture so she could eventually join the family business as a designer. Her natural talent for spatial relationships and aesthetic design had already contributed to several of the company's most successful projects. The personal side of Anthony's life had flourished as well. He and Maria had married in a small ceremony, attended by close family and friends, creating a blended household that felt natural and loving. Maria's 2 children from her previous marriage had embraced Anthony as a stepfather, while Lucas and Beatrice welcomed Maria as the mother figure they'd been missing for years. Their home, a custom-built house that showcased the best of Anthony's construction skills and Maria's architectural vision, had become a gathering place for the extended family and business associates who made up their circle. It was everything Sandra had claimed to want years earlier, but built on a foundation of mutual respect and shared values rather than materialism and status. The phone call came on a Tuesday afternoon while Anthony was reviewing blueprints for a new commercial development. His secretary informed him that Sandra was on the line, calling from a rehabilitation facility in Tucson, where she was finally attempting to address the addiction issues that had contributed to her recent legal troubles. "Anthony," Sandra's voice was different, quieter, more thoughtful, lacking the demanding tone he remembered from their marriage and her attempts at reconciliation. "I know I have no right to call you, and I understand if you don't want to talk to me, but I wanted you to know that I'm getting help, and I wanted to apologize." What followed was perhaps the first genuinely honest conversation Anthony had ever had with his ex-wife. Sandra acknowledged the cruelty of her abandonment, the selfishness of her attempts to return when she needed financial help, and the foolishness of squandering every opportunity Anthony had given her to rebuild her relationship with their children. "I spent years telling you that you weren't enough," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "The truth is, I was the one who wasn't enough. Not as a wife, not as a mother, not as a human being. You became everything I claimed I wanted, and I was too broken to recognize or appreciate it." Anthony listened without interruption, recognizing that this conversation was more about Sandra's need for redemption than his need for apology. The angry, hurt man who had once craved acknowledgement from her was gone, replaced by someone who had found validation through his own achievements and the love of people who truly valued him. "Sandra," he said when she finished, "I appreciate you calling, and I hope your treatment is successful. I want you to get healthy, not for my sake, but because Lucas and Beatrice deserve to have a mother they can be proud of someday." There was a long pause before Sandra asked the question he'd been expecting. "Is there any chance that someday, when I'm better, we might—" But Anthony stopped her gently before she could finish. "Sandra, what we had is part of the past now. I've built a new life with people who appreciate the man I've always been, not just what I've accomplished. But if you can prove over time that you're committed to being healthy and stable, Lucas and Beatrice might be willing to have a relationship with you as their mother." After ending the call, Anthony returned to his blueprints with a sense of closure he hadn't expected to feel. The woman who had once defined his worth through her criticism and abandonment had finally acknowledged what he'd known all along, that he'd always been enough, just not for her. That evening, as Anthony walked through the latest Martinez construction development with Maria, watching young families move into homes he'd built with his own vision and effort, he reflected on the journey from Sandra's abandonment to this moment of complete fulfillment. "You know what the best part is?" Maria asked, reading his thoughts with the intuition of someone who truly knew him. "You didn't become successful to prove anything to Sandra or anyone else. You became successful because that's who you always were. You just needed the freedom to show it." Anthony smiled, watching Lucas direct the installation of playground equipment in the development's central park, while Beatrice sketched ideas for the community garden. These were his true foundations, not the concrete and steel he'd worked with for decades, but the family, love, and self-respect he'd built from the ruins of his first marriage. Sandra had left him because she wanted a man who built businesses, instead of just laying foundations. She never realized that the man she'd married had always possessed the vision and determination to build an empire. He just needed someone to believe in him, instead of tearing him down. Now, surrounded by the fruits of his labor and the love of people who valued his true worth, Anthony Martinez could honestly say that Sandra's abandonment had been the best thing that ever happened to him, not because of the pain it caused, but because of the strength it revealed and the life it ultimately made possible.